Thank you very much for joining us tonight for our Center for Common Ground election recap. We are going to be looking at the states where we work, what they look like before the election, what they look like now. Next slide. Since we have so many people that are new to us tonight, I want to do a quick introduction of Center for Common Ground. We were founded to educate and empower underrepresented voters in voter suppression states so that they can engage not only in elections, but after elections, advocate for their right to vote. Together, we can build a democracy that prioritizes the voices of all people, and all means all y'all. Next slide. We are a community of color-led organization. On behalf of our board members, I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Board co-chairs, Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, Dr. Gabriela Limas, Deepak Puri, Katie Hornung, and yes, they let me be on the board. Isn't that amazing? Next slide. Now, where we are right now, there are still 3 Senate races that are undecided. So right now, the US Senate sits at 48 on the Democratic side, 49 on the Republican side. Arizona is still undecided, and I took the image from the New York Times. So, and I realized I spelled elections wrong. I'll fix it. Where you can see that incumbent Senator Mark Kelly does have a lead, and it's more than a slight lead over Blake Masters. He has a lead of nearly 100,000 votes. They will continue to count votes in Arizona. Only 70% of the votes are in. And after they count the votes, they will probably insist on a hand count, and there may be a number of other machinations that we hear about before Arizona certifies the 2022 election. Next slide. Nevada. Nevada had some bad weather, and the bad weather slowed a lot of the ballots from one of the more northern counties from arriving where they were supposed to be in time to be counted. So as you can see, there is about a 16,000 vote difference between the incumbent Democrat and the Republican is currently leading. Let's go to Georgia. Now, in Georgia, Georgia law states that any election where no candidate gets 50% of the vote plus one will, by law, go to a runoff. Apparently, I knew there was going to be a runoff in Georgia. The Georgia Board of Elections apparently did not, and they seem to have not made any preparations. So while we have launched postcarding today to the super voters in Georgia, currently we do not know where early voting locations are going to be. We also are not exactly certain when early voting is supposed to start. According to Georgia law, prior to SB 202, the runoff election should or early voting for the runoff election should be starting on November 14th. Richmond County has announced that early voting will begin on November 28th, and it will end on December 2nd. So it could be a very short early voting window. It could be that we see counties announcing different dates when they start early voting. So far, the Georgia State Board of Elections has been mum on the subject of when does early voting begin, when does it end, and where is it? So it's going to be a very, very, very interesting election. But then Georgia always is. Next slide. Now, Georgia. In Georgia, there was a ton of offices on the ballot. And amazingly, the only office that is going to a runoff is the US Senate race. The Georgia House race has been decided, the US House. It is now 9 Republicans and 5 Democrats. All statewide offices remained as they currently are. They are in Republican control, and Georgia right now on the state level remains a trifecta. Now, the Georgia state legislature was also on the ballot. Before the election, the numbers on the left are pre-election. The numbers on the right are after the 2022 election. Georgia has a very large state house. They have 180 House seats and they have 56 Senate seats. What we're seeing in Georgia is in the Georgia House, the Democrats picked up 4 seats and went from 75 to 79. The Republicans lost 3 seats, but there is still 1 seat that is undecided. On the Georgia State Senate side, the same thing. We saw the Democrats pick up 1 seat, and the Republicans, of course, lost a seat. Next slide. Now, early voting, when we were looking at Georgia, looked very, very promising. Georgia did have the highest turnout for African American voters of any state at roughly 32%. Next slide. I'm a numbers person, so I like keeping track of statistics. In North Carolina, we had a very, very, very mixed bag. We saw a steady turnout of African American voters, 19%, nothing like Georgia. North Carolina actually has a larger BIPOC population than Georgia. Now, in North Carolina, while the Dems did not win the Senate seat, they did pick up 2 US House seats. And after redistricting, rather than having 13 House seats, they actually now have 1 more. They have 14. Next slide. And the North Carolina State House, they lost people in the State House. So they went from 51 Dems to 48, 69 Republicans to 70. there are still 2 seats that are undecided. In the state Senate, they went from 22 Dems to 28 Republicans to 30. So North Carolina was able to retain their Democratic governor. So North Carolina, while disappointing to some, was a very mixed bag. Next slide. All right, now Virginia, which had no statewide races at all, but had 3 contested US House races. 2 were on the toss-up list, and 1 was on its leaning Democratic, but we're not really sure. The African American turnout in Virginia was steady. Again, nothing to rival what we were seeing in Georgia. And I've got Alabama numbers there, so we're going to ignore the registered voters. I'll swap that out. Virginia has 11 House seats, and before the election, there were 7 Dems, 4 Republicans. Now, because we lost 1 House seat, there are 6 Dems and 5 Republicans. Next slide. Now, in Virginia, we did not see racial gerrymandering, but we saw the worst case of gender gerrymandering that anyone can ever imagine. Of the 7 Democratic representatives in Virginia, 3 were women. Abigail Spanberger, District 7, which just happens to be my new district, Jennifer Wexton, District 10, and Elaine Luria, District 2. When you look at the left side and you look at the partisan lean of the 11 seats, all of the seats that are 14 and above, actually most of the seats that are 30 and above actually belong to the men. When you look at the seats D2, D8, R6, those were the seats for the women. We won in CD7 and CD10. We were not successful in CD2. Next slide. And we're just going to go to the next slide. I already covered that. One of the things that we are able to look at in Virginia, courtesy of the Virginia Public Access Project, is they do graph the turnout by congressional district. So since we did work in CD7, CD2, and CD10, you can see that most of those are in the upper part of the turnout list, because we were working on turning out infrequent voters that normally don't vote in the midterms. Next slide. Florida. Florida was an interesting place. In Florida, when we look at where they are now in the US House, they have 8 Democratic seats, 20 Republican seats. And when we look at the Florida State House, they lost seats in both the House and also in the Senate. Next slide. Florida had a rather anemic turnout of African American voters, only at 9.7%. So the result in Florida is disturbing, concerning, because when we look at the registered voters in Florida, Florida is already a majority minority state based on the number of registered voters. Now, when we look at the US House in Florida, again in Florida, we lost seats. We went from 9 Democratic seats to 8 seats, from 16 Republicans to 20 seats. The really wonderful historic news in Florida is that Maxwell Alejandro Frost, the first member of Generation Z, was elected to Congress from Val Deming's old district. Next slide. All right, now, we are currently distributing addresses for the Georgia runoff. We polled 879,000 addresses for Black super voters, and they are available right now. I'm going to bring up the postcard team to talk about and give you any information you may need to know about postcarding in Georgia for the runoff. Again, we don't exactly have the date when early voting begins, and we don't exactly know where it will be, other than probably in the registrar's office.
Thanks, Andrea. And I will pitch in. Carrie is sick. We distributed 430,000 addresses today to Black consistent voters, that is to say reliable voters in Georgia. And we have about half that many again available. Maybe they'll go tomorrow. This was the first day that we offered those addresses, and it's just been crazy. People are literally pounding down the doors for postcards and addresses. I posted in chat that if you want to get involved in postcarding, we do it regionally depending on where you live. So contact your regional organizer, and I posted that link in chat. The other thing that people ask is how many addresses have we sent so far? We've distributed 2.6 million addresses this year. We did 1.5 million, 1.4 million for the primaries, and another 1.3 million for the general election in November. And it looks like we'll do, a little bit under 1 million probably for the runoff. So it's pretty remarkable. People love doing it. It makes people feel good. It's effective. We're reaching people with these really colorful postcards who aren't going to be reached in any other way. The reason we're doing consistent voters right now for Georgia, those people are going to vote if they know that there's an election, but there's so little time to, if they're not really focused and they're not really paying attention to the news, they're going to miss that election. So we're picking the 879,000 reliable voters.
All right, and someone asked the question, why are we postcarding in the name of the Georgia NAHCP? And we are postcarding using their name because they are known. They were the founders of Team Unity, and Team Unity is working throughout Georgia, and they are on the ground. So we wanted to use a name that voters would recognize. They will recognize the Georgia NAHCP. Next slide. Now, we will be launching our phone banks on Thursday. The Georgia Board of Elections said by Tuesday, they should have early voting information, and they should have the polling locations figured out. So again, we were ready for the runoff. Apparently, they weren't quite ready. So we are going to need people on the phones. I have pulled 295,000 cell phone numbers of Black voters who voted early. Next slide. Now, when we do texting, we will be texting to the largest counties in Georgia in terms of population of Black voters. And everyone that we will be texting early voted. So we want to make sure that they know when their counties have finally decided when and where early voting will be. Next slide. Now, we are going to be doing a virtual fundraiser on Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern, because we just went through an election in multiple states, and now we basically get to do Georgia all over again. So please join me, my team. Our very dear friend, Reverend Juan Smith, will be acting as an MC for us. And we will have some of our Georgia partners on the line. So that is my presentation. And let's get started with Q&A. So I know there are some questions in the chat. No, we are not reaching out to people who did not vote. If they did not vote in the primary, it will be even harder to get them to vote in a runoff. So no, we are only reaching out to super voters. Great question, Patricia.
Someone had asked in the early chat if you could talk about funding for Reclaim Our Vote in the Center for Common Ground, you know, what we need money for and that it's tax deductible and so forth.
Well, strangely enough, Center for Common Ground is a 501c3 organization, and then we do all of our election work as a 501c3. And one of the reasons we work as a C3, because it does allow us to partner with national faith organizations. We did receive a grant, not for elections, but for our year-round work after the elections. So we get very little grant funding. We are mostly funded by people like yourselves who are on this call. We are funded by our volunteers. Some of our volunteers have small family foundations. It is very rare that we see a grant of $50,000 or more. We have more than enough people to text for us, so we will probably only be inviting some of our local partners if they want to text and need training. We have built an army of texters, and our interns may text with us. Students for Justice are our interns. I see a question from Mary Claire. Any comments on why Stacey Abrams lost? Well, one of the interesting things about Georgia is you have to remember where Georgia is. Georgia is a deep southern state. So that means Georgia is both racist and sexist. So in the case of Stacey Abrams, it becomes interesting to figure out the people that voted on the US Senate race and did not bring that vote over to the governor's race, you're thinking it probably shouldn't have been racism, although Chase Oliver was a libertarian who took 2% of the vote. So was it sexism? So again, we have to remember where Georgia is located. Great questions. Other questions that are in the chat.
Someone
Oh.
asked about the youth vote. Could you talk about the youth turnout?
Well, in early vote, the youth turnout was terrible. I think the state that had the highest youth turnout had about 9 or 10%. In most states, the 18 to 29 turnout, now this is early voting, was running roughly, early voting, it was running 6-7%. Now, we did get, probably the turnout will be almost 20%. Maybe in some states, it may edge up when we look at election day turnout. Now, when we compare this with the 55 and over turnout, our turnout is above 48% on average. So better than expected, not good. All right. Board Forward is doing letter writing, and we want to be involved. And the addresses for Center for Common Ground have been snatched up. Now, our postcards are very effective, and they're effective for two reasons. Number one, the imagery on our postcard, and number two, the information we provide to voters. We make sure that voters have enough information to be able to vote. There are many people where we're going to try to call them, or we're going to try to text them, where we may just simply have a wrong number. Our wrong address rate in the system that we use is exceedingly low. It's probably around 2%. So when we send someone a postcard, figure there's a 98% chance they're going to get that postcard. For some lower income folks, for some of the more rural areas of Cobb County and Chatham County, this may be one of the few contacts that people get. So not only are we doing outreach in the Atlanta area, we are making it a point also to get outside the Atlanta area. Now, phone banking is always great. Any of the things that we do where you are remote and you can't go knock on a door, every touch helps. It really, really does. And then, yeah.
There's a good question in the chat about if you could speak more about Florida a little bit in terms of low turnout amongst Black voters there. I think that'd be a good question.
Well, in Florida, we are not on the ground in Florida. We are a virtual organization. We don't have any democracy centers in Florida. We have democracy centers in Virginia. We have democracy centers in Georgia. We have one in North Carolina. Since we have no on-the-ground presence, we discovered there had been virtually no outreach to voters in Florida, especially African American voters. So we did a very quick text turnaround of about 350,000 texts. But from what we can see and what we heard from other organizations, there really was very little outreach to Black voters. And again, if you don't do outreach to voters, if you don't make sure they have the information, one of the problems with Florida is the state of Florida did not produce a state website where you could go look up your county and find out where early voting was. Each county had their own individual website. So when you're looking at older voters, poorer voters, more rural voters who don't have the internet, there's no way to find the early voting locations. All right, do we have other questions? Okay, and I see there's a question about the numbers. When you add, and I'm going to have to go look at Florida and make sure I was doing a lot of wild copying and pasting, that I did not copy from one of my other states. Let me go get the actual Florida numbers from a state that I did when I had absolutely nothing else to do. Florida has 1.9 million Black voters. They have 2.7 million Hispanic voters. Oh, yes, I see what you mean. One of my numbers is wrong. That 2.6 million Hispanic voters should be higher. Yes, there's a typo. It's almost 3 million Hispanic voters. And then when you add the others, it is a little more than 50%. Yep, I've got a typo. Thank you for catching that.
Andrea, could you share the chat, the website that you use to look at this data?
No, that is not a public
Not
website.
Turbo.
No.
Not the other vote thing? Okay.
No, that is my research website. That is not public.
Never mind.
Andrea, we have someone that asked if we could have more presence in Wisconsin and Kentucky. Can you talk about the kind of states we do?
That will never happen. Number one, Wisconsin is 5% BIPOC. The mandate from my board is that the state must be 20% registered voters, BIPOC. Wisconsin will probably not for 20 years get near that. Kentucky also is only 14%. I've looked. And we aren't looking at census population. We look only at registered voters. Another great question, that is also why we are not in Pennsylvania, 12% BIPOC, Ohio, 11% BIPOC.
Andrea, there's some concern about whether we still have addresses or how many addresses we still have available for postcarding.
Can I clarify that a little too? We have currently about 880,000 addresses. We released 430,000 of them today. I mean, I'm joking, but let's say we get rid of the rest of them tomorrow, we will find other addresses. That would be a miracle. But for now, we still have almost 500,000 addresses out there.
And again, remember, these are super voters. These are voters who vote in almost every election. When we look at early voting in Georgia. And now this is a public website. Anybody can go and look at that. Nearly 803,000 African Americans voted early. So I'm going to drop the Target Early website in the chat, and that's a public website. You don't need a subscription. Anybody can go to that website and you can look at the early voting numbers. They don't have the final vote numbers yet because no state has certified the elections. Again, we will never go into those states because investment in voter files, $30,000 per state. We do not have the resources to work in more states than we currently do. It was a struggle to work in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Georgia. In the primary, we did work in Texas. We did some phone support in Texas and Arizona. So luckily in 2023, there will be one state. Virginia in 2023 will have their entire General Assembly up for election. Virginia loves elections. We have them every year. So again, we will not go into other states. Yes, it's worth ordering the postcards. Yes, there was an increased number of BIPOC voters in rural Georgia. When you go and get the Target Early, it will give you the numbers from 2018, 2020, and 2022. Georgia did have no excuse early voting in 2018. Not a lot of people really took advantage of it, but after the pandemic, it really became a thing. When we look at states like Virginia, Virginia did not have no excuse early voting until 2020. That is why when you look at our 2018 numbers, they are so incredibly low. Yes. The Democratic Party of Wisconsin right now is run by Ben Wickler. Ben Wickler comes out of moveon.org. So they have a very, very, very effective party in Wisconsin.
Andrea, there's an interesting question. Can you compare the number of super voters that we have to the number of Black voters that voted in the Warnock-Walker race the other day? Did our people all vote, our 879,000?
We can't tell who's Black and who's white based on who voted. The actual numbers will not post for at least 3 weeks. They will post after the election is certified, and at that point they'll be available to PDI or NGP van. So right now we have numbers, but we can't associate them correctly with race until they go through either an NGP van or a PDI. Hey, Jan, how are you? calling out people that I know. All right. Wow. Okay. Yes. Go phone bankers. Yes. Mary Claire, do you have the Cure link for Nevada? It's probably out on Mobilize. All right. All righty. Yes. 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 We need to reach the loyal voters and less frequent voters. We don't have enough resources, people on the phones to call the less frequent voters. What we found in reaching out to the less frequent voters, that's where we have the most bad numbers. When we call the loyal voters, people who turn out all the time, those tend to be the good phone numbers. So the problem with this runoff is people are not used to voting in December. They're just not. Runoffs in Georgia used to be before SB 202 in early January. So literally the runoff is 28 days from the general. Since we don't know and can't find where the early voting locations are, and we know all the secret places they like to hide them, we are relying on our people in Georgia who know election officials to try to get that information from the election officials as soon as the counties decide. This is where these are the locations we're going to open for early voting. And this is when we're going to hold early voting.
Andrea, there was a question in chat. Can you describe what it means to cure the ballot? What curing the ballot
Ballot
is?
curing is when people use vote by mail. Vote by mail is very, very complicated. It's much harder than voting in person. So generally, when you receive a vote by mail ballot, you vote the ballot, and then you have to put it inside a security envelope. And then you need to sign and date the envelope. Some states, the voter suppression ones, are very, very strict about, well, you didn't put the date on it, so we're not going to count your ballot. Or other states will signature match. Now, I don't know about you, but my signature that is on my driver's license, which I got back in 2006, does not match today. So if I look at how I signed my name today and how I signed it then, it's very different. I could only sign them the same way if I was looking at my driver's license and literally drew my signature. So ballot curing is the process of calling voters whose ballot has been rejected for some technicality to give them an opportunity to come and correct the problem. Some people send in their vote by mail ballot and they forget to sign it. Some states require a witness to your signature on a vote by mail ballot. Vote by mail or voting absentee can be very, very complicated, especially if you're older, if you're unfamiliar, and you just, how often do you vote? Every 2 years. So that's what happens.
Before we end, say something more about the Sunday fundraising, what we're doing it for, and Juan Smith will be there, who's this wonderfully inspiring reverend and environmental justice activist in Georgia.
And she is from the great state of Georgia. So I've got an invite out to Ray McClendon and Richard Rose, the Atlanta/Georgia NAACP. I may see if I can get my election buddy on. We will have some of our, hopefully we'll be able to get some of our Georgia Democracy Center leaders on to talk about the mood on the ground. I've been chasing Cliff Albright, Black Voters Matter. What are they doing? So what we are doing in Georgia is, as I said, I have 296,000 cell numbers of Georgia voters to text. So that's an extra expense. When the election is over, we were budgeted for all the texting that we did for the 2022 election. Now we've got a whole nother election to run that wasn't really in the budget. So we're going to have texters. We want to make sure we have enough people on the phone. We are going to be hiring paid phone bankers. We are also going to be hiring paid canvassers. One of the advantages of being partnered with the Georgia NAACP and being part of Team Unity is their partners are other Black groups on the ground. They're partnered with the Divine Nine. So these are the Black fraternities and the Black sororities, and Black Voters Matter. And through this partnership, everyone works together, so we make sure we don't all go and do the same thing in the same place. We spread out the love and we cover as much of the state as we possibly can. So that's our plan. Yes, I like that. Virginia women are getting the job done. Yes. Love it. There's another interesting question. With Brian Kemp throwing all his resources to helping Walker, is this going to be a decisive factor? Only if turnout is low. If turnout is high, no. Because we're not running voter registration, so there's not going to be any voter registrations to not process, or if there are, there won't be that many. So we won't be looking at 50,000 voter registrations that just weirdly enough didn't get processed. Now, we will do Hispanic voters in 2024, in presidential years when people are more generous in their fundraising, and we can do outreach in multiple languages. For this midterm, we were only going to work in one language, English. So we decided only African American voters because most speak English. We would have to build the phone bank. We don't have to paper list. Everything that we do is digital so that we can count it. The people who do fund us want numbers on everything that we do. And yes, phone banking with us is very, very simple because we are not selling candidates. We are just giving voters information on how they can go and cast their ballots. It is very, very different than trying to sell a candidate. And now it's true, the people we were calling in the general, these were folks who were infrequent voters. So these are people party's not going to call them, candidates aren't going to call them because they're not frequent voters. We are now converting to the super voters. They might get a little testy. Do we have anything else? Yes, I love this. Voter suppression is very much alive and well in Georgia, in South Carolina, in North Carolina, in Alabama, in Florida, and even in many parts of rural Virginia. We saw it. Yeah. All right, are there any questions that I need to answer in the chat? Yeah. Oh, and yes, Cynthia, I love your comment. In Oregon, vote by mail is easy peasy. Well, that's because in the great state of Oregon, they want their voters to be able to vote. That is not true in the states where we work. They want some voters to be able to vote and others not so much. Yeah. Thank you, Mary Claire, for the Nevada information. And yes, people want to do everything they can do to help. So I'm going, I love this. I love that there are so many of you who care about supporting people in other states. Have I heard anything at all about ID hijacking? That is a new one. Oh, interesting. Now, here's the deal with ID hijacking. Day one of those numbers. When groups text, we buy phone numbers so that you are not texting with your own personal numbers. Anybody at any campaign can buy numbers. And when one campaign gets done using a number, that number gets assigned to another campaign. So yes, that very much could be the case. I don't know that it's ID hijacking as much as that's the way NDLC forces us to work. That's very, very interesting.
And that last question about, do you have any predictions about the people who voted for the third party candidate and what they might do in the runoff?
Well, that's going to be interesting. Libertarians are Republicans. So again, this is Georgia. So I'm going, were there Republican voters in Georgia who wanted to vote in the Senate race, but could not bring themselves to vote for a Black man? And there were two Black men running, and Chase Oliver is not Black. So how much, what percentage of that vote was the, I can't make myself do it, but I do want to vote in that race. And then you also have people who are libertarians, and Herschel Walker was not really speaking to the heart of what libertarians believe. My son is a libertarian, and he would have a lot of problems with Herschel Walker's views. They would not be right-wing enough in certain areas for him. So a libertarian would be more to his liking. And then there's always those people that want to do a protest vote. I forget what state I was looking at. The Arizona, they actually have on their ballot none of the above. I don't like any of them. I'm not voting for any of them. So it's not a write-in. It's just, no, I don't like any of them. I thought that was very, very interesting. Yes, and then once we win in Georgia, then we will need to come back and do major wins in Virginia. Yes, all paid canvassers are local people, and they're going to be local people from the community. Yes. We do not coordinate with Vote Forward, no. And one of the reasons we send postcards, and it's a cultural thing, is Vote Forward sends letters. In many African American households, I know it was true in mine, and I'm even guilty of it. If I get a letter and I don't know who it's from, and it's not a check and it's not a bill, it goes in the pile. And then when the pile reaches a certain height, if nobody has caused me to go in there and pull out that letter, I throw them all away. That is why we will never use letters. We use postcards so that people see the image and they see the message and they immediately know what it's about. And no, I don't believe Vote Forward really has a major effort toward African American voters. And yes, we are recording this video, and this video will be available to you.
Probably tomorrow, there will be an email that goes out to everyone. It's been a little busy, so it might be the next day.
And then a very good question: what is the likelihood of the third-party voters moving over to Walker? Well, it's going to be interesting. It will be, were they truly a protest vote? If they were, they are not going to Walker. Did they vote for Chase because he was not a Black man? They're not going to Walker either. Did they vote for him purely because he was a libertarian and he represented their values? These voters could either go either way, or they might stay home. Mhm. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yes. Yes. We really do enjoy phone banking. That is great. All right. I think we got all the questions answered. Well, there's a question comment. High voter turnout favors Dems. Generally and historically speaking, high voter turnout does favor Dems. Now, what gets interesting is a runoff is a special election, at which point every rule that you ever knew about elections goes out the window. You're having an election at a date and time where people just aren't used to it. And you've got to make them know the election is there and get them sort of fired up that they're going to be willing to go vote in it. Yeah, third-party voters are really interesting people. And yes, our national guided phone banks are live trainings for people who have never used our system. So you can join a national guided phone bank. That will be on Thursday at 6. There will be trainers there. So if you are very new to phone banking, we've got trainers that can help you with that. If you're just new to our system, we've got trainers who can help you with that. And then once you feel comfortable, you are free to make calls 7 days a week between the hours of 9 a.m. and 8 p.m. Yeah. All righty. Yes. Oh, yes. And then I saw a comment in the chat. Many people were at the wrong polling place as it is constantly changing. So one of the things that we do in our phone banks, and especially in our text banks, because believe me, the polling locations where people voted in the general are going to be very different in the runoff. There are probably going to be 30% less polling places, and they may be in different places. So our work on doing outreach to voters and making sure they understand where they vote will be critical. All right, all right. Take care, everybody. Yes. Oh, yes, 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 yes.